The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains of Margot's small kitchen, casting long shadows over the neatly arranged teacups on the counter. She sat at the table, her hands cradling a warm mug of chamomile tea, staring out at her modest backyard garden. The quiet had become her constant companion over the years, a silence punctuated only by the occasional hum of her fridge or the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. At 54, Margot's days had settled into a predictable rhythm. Mornings were for tending to her flowers, afternoons for reading, and evenings spent with her knitting needles clicking softly in front of the television. It wasn't a bad life, she often reminded herself, but it was a life of careful routine, shaped by years of solitude since her children had grown and left, and her marriage had dissolved quietly into the past. One Thursday morning, Margot found herself at the local grocery store, as she did every week, pushing a cart through aisles she knew by heart. She paused in the produce section, inspecting a cluster of bananas when a voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me, do you know how to pick a good one?" Margot turned to see a man standing beside her. He looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark, tousled hair and a boyish grin that immediately softened his otherwise rugged features. He held up a bunch of bananas, his expression earnest. Caught off guard, Margot chuckled softly. "Well, it depends on what you're looking for. If you want them to last a few days, go for the ones with some green. If you're planning to eat them right away, pick the yellow ones." The man nodded seriously, as if she'd just imparted profound wisdom. "Thank you. I've been staring at these for 10 minutes, trying to decide." Margot smiled, her chest warming at the unexpected interaction. She moved to walk away, but he spoke again. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you. I just moved to town last week, and I'm still figuring out how to adult properly." He extended a hand. "I'm Alex." "Margot," she replied, taking his hand briefly. His handshake was firm but friendly. "Nice to meet you, Margot. Thanks for the banana advice. I'll let you know if it changes my life," he said with a wink before disappearing down the next aisle. As she continued her shopping, Margot couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. It wasn't just his smile or his easy charm. It was the way his presence had momentarily pierced the bubble of her solitude. By the time she reached the checkout line, she caught herself smiling at the thought of their brief conversation. That night, as she sat knitting in her usual chair, the memory of Alex lingered. It was such a small, ordinary moment, but it felt like something more, a spark of light in her otherwise quiet and predictable world. The next week, Margot found herself back at the grocery store. She hadn't consciously thought about Alex, at least, not in a way she wanted to admit, but as she strolled through the aisles, she found herself glancing up more often than usual. It was in the bakery section that she saw him again, holding a loaf of bread and squinting at the label like it held the secrets of the universe. He looked up, spotted her, and broke into a grin. "Margot, the banana expert. Fancy meeting you here." She laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "I'm hardly an expert, but it's good to see you again." They started talking, first about the bread he was debating between sourdough and whole grain, and then about the town. Alex shared that he had moved here for work, though he didn't elaborate on what he did. Margot, in turn, told him about her favorite spots in the area. The park with the old oak trees, the small cafe tucked away on a side street, the quiet library she loved. "You'll have to give me a proper tour sometime," he said as they walked to the checkout together. She waved it off with a laugh, but his words lingered. In the weeks that followed, their paths seemed to cross more often. At first, it was always at the grocery store, where their casual chats turned into longer conversations. He'd ask her about cooking tips or local recommendations, and she found herself looking forward to these encounters in a way she hadn't felt in years. One day, Alex suggested they grab coffee after their shopping. Margot hesitated but agreed, and soon they were sitting in a cozy cafe, the aroma of roasted beans and fresh pastries filling the air. Their conversation flowed effortlessly. He talked about his love for hiking and photography, while she shared stories about her garden and the travels she used to dream about but never quite pursued. He listened intently, his eyes lighting up at her tales, and she felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. Over time, coffee outings became a regular occurrence. Alex would text her occasionally, always something light and cheerful, like a picture of a lopsided cake he'd tried to bake or a funny sign he'd seen during a hike. Margot found herself smiling more often, her days no longer feeling so monotonous. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they walked through the park she had recommended, Alex turned to her with a curious expression. "You know, Margot, you're probably the most interesting person I've met since I moved here. You have this way of making the ordinary feel special." Her breath caught, and she felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "I think you're giving me too much credit," she replied, her voice softer than usual. But Alex shook his head, his smile warm and sincere. "I mean it." That night, as she sat in her quiet living room, Margot replayed his words in her mind. It had been years since anyone had seen her in that way, had made her feel remarkable. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but she knew one thing for certain. Alex had brought something into her life that she hadn't realized she was missing. Margot woke the next morning feeling lighter, as though some unseen weight had been lifted. Her days, once filled with the quiet hum of predictable routines, now held a sense of anticipation. She found herself looking forward to Alex's texts, their chance encounters, and the easy way he made her laugh. Still, she told herself it was nothing more than friendship. After all, Alex was decades younger, practically young enough to be her son. What could he possibly see in her beyond a kind companion with a knack for grocery store wisdom? But then, there was that moment in the park, the way he had looked at her, his words lingering in her mind like a melody she couldn't forget. "You have this way of making the ordinary feel special." The memory made her heart race in a way she hadn't felt in years. And that frightened her. A week later, they were walking through the park again. The leaves had turned fiery shades of orange and red, crunching under their feet as they wandered along the winding paths. Alex was sharing a story about his childhood, his voice animated and full of life, when Margot suddenly felt it, a pang deep in her chest. It wasn't just his stories or his charm. It was the way he listened to her, the way he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and her past. It was the way he looked at her, not with pity or condescension, but with something deeper, something she dared not name. That evening, as she sat in her favorite chair with a book open on her lap, the realization hit her like a wave crashing onto shore. She was falling for him. Her breath caught, and she closed the book, setting it aside as if the act of reading no longer mattered. How had this happened? She hadn't been looking for anything, least of all a romantic connection, and certainly not with someone so much younger. Her thoughts spiraled. What would Alex think if he knew? Would he be horrified? Amused? And what would people say? The whispers, the judgment, she could already imagine it. "You're old enough to know better," she muttered to herself, the words cutting deeper than she expected. But the feelings were there, undeniable and relentless. She couldn't ignore the way her heart lifted when she saw his name on her phone, or how the sound of his laughter made the world feel a little brighter. Margot leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the darkened sky. A part of her wanted to lock these feelings away, to bury them before they grew too large to contain. But another part, a quieter, braver part, whispered that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for her to feel this way. For the first time in years, she felt alive for days. Margot wrestled with her emotions. It was as if her heart and mind had become adversaries in a battle she couldn't escape. Her heart clung to the possibility of something beautiful, something unexpected, while her mind painted vivid pictures of rejection, ridicule, and the undeniable truth of their age difference. She began avoiding Alex, finding reasons to decline his invitations for coffee or walks. Her text replies grew shorter, less frequent. Each time her phone buzzed with his name on the screen, she felt a pang of guilt, followed by the sting of self-doubt. One rainy afternoon, Margot sat by the window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. Her garden was a blur of green and gray beyond the pane, and the sound of rain seemed to echo the turmoil inside her. She thought about the last time she had truly opened her heart to someone. It had been years, decades really, since she'd felt this way. The memories of her marriage surfaced uninvited. The love she and her ex-husband had shared had faded slowly, like a photograph left too long in the sun. They had been kind to one another, but the passion, the spark, had disappeared long before the papers were signed. With Alex, it was different. He made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years, maybe ever. But the fear of what it could cost her was paralyzing. What if he only saw her as a mother figure? What if her feelings made him uncomfortable? And what if others found out? The judgment of strangers was one thing, but she couldn't bear the thought of her children, or even Alex, thinking less of her. One evening, Margot found herself sitting at her desk, a blank piece of paper before her. She picked up a pen and began to write, pouring out everything she couldn't say aloud. Dear Alex, you've brought light into my life in ways I never expected. I don't know how to say this without risking what we have, but I've been struggling with feelings I never thought I'd feel again. She stopped, her hand trembling. The words felt both liberating and terrifying. Folding the paper neatly, she placed it in a drawer, telling herself it was enough to have written it, even if it would never be read. The next day, Alex texted her. Hope everything's okay. Haven't heard from you in a while. Miss our talks. Her heart ached as she read the message. She knew she couldn't keep avoiding him. Whatever she decided to do, she owed him honesty. As she typed out a reply, let's talk soon, she realized she wasn't just afraid of how he might feel. She was afraid of how much she wanted this, how deeply she yearned to embrace the possibility of love again. The decision came to Margot in the stillness of the evening, as she sat with a cup of tea by the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside glistening under the soft glow of the streetlights. She stared into the amber depths of her tea, thinking of Alex's message. Miss our talks. The words lingered in her mind, tugging at her heart. She couldn't keep running from him, from the connection they had built. Yet, she also knew she couldn't meet him in a cafe or walk through the park without her nerves betraying her. She needed a place where she felt comfortable, where she could take control of the conversation and her emotions. Her home. The thought made her pulse quicken. Inviting him over felt intimate, vulnerable, a step towards something she wasn't sure she was ready for but couldn't ignore. The next morning, after much deliberation, she picked up her phone and typed out a message. Hi, Alex. I've been thinking about your last message. Would you like to come over for tea sometime this week? I've been baking again, and I'd love to share some with you. Her thumb hovered over the send button. A dozen doubts flashed through her mind. Was this too forward? Would he think she had ulterior motives? With a deep breath, she hit send and placed the phone down, walking away before she could overanalyze. When her phone buzzed an hour later, she hesitated before picking it up. Margot, that sounds wonderful. I'd love to. What day works best for you? Relief washed over her, followed quickly by a rush of nerves. They settled on Friday afternoon, giving her a few days to prepare. As the week passed, Margot found herself fussing over every detail. She cleaned the house thoroughly, though it was already spotless. She chose her best china for the tea and spent hours flipping through recipe books, settling on a lemon drizzle cake she hadn't made in years. When Friday arrived, she woke early, her stomach fluttering with equal parts excitement and apprehension. She spent the morning baking, the scent of fresh lemon and sugar filling the house. By noon, the cake was cooling on the counter, and she found herself pacing the living room, checking the clock every few minutes. At precisely 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Taking a steadying breath, Margot opened the door to find Alex standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other. He smiled, his eyes warm and kind. For you, he said, holding out the flowers. I didn't want to show up empty-handed. Margot's heart swelled as she took the bouquet, the simple gesture catching her off guard. They're beautiful. Thank you. As he stepped inside, she felt a mix of emotions, nervousness, hope, and something she dared not name just yet. The afternoon unfolded in a way that felt almost surreal to Margot. As they settled into her cozy living room, she noticed how effortlessly Alex fit into the space she had carefully curated for herself. The room felt warmer with him there, as though his presence brought a new light to the familiar surroundings. She poured the tea, trying to hide her nerves beneath the calm smile she had perfected over the years. Alex was sitting across from her, looking relaxed, yet there was a certain softness to his gaze that made her heart race. "This cake smells incredible," he remarked, leaning forward. "I have a feeling I'm in for a treat." Margot laughed, pouring the tea into delicate cups. "Well, I hope it lives up to the hype." They continued talking as they always did, lightheartedly at first, then delving into more meaningful topics. Alex spoke about his life before moving to the town, his travels, and the places he longed to visit. Margot shared stories of her late husband, the adventures they'd once dreamed of but never taken. It was a conversation that felt intimate, but not overly so, as though they were still on the edge of something, skirting around the deeper truths neither was ready to face. But then, as the conversation began to flow more freely, Alex leaned forward again, his expression softer now. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his voice quiet. Margot felt her breath catch in her chest. She had no idea what was coming, but she was suddenly aware of how close he was, how the space between them had diminished without her even realizing. "What's that?" she asked, trying to keep her tone steady, even though her heart was pounding. "Why did you move here?" The question was innocent enough, but it struck a chord. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had kept hidden, even from him. She'd told him about her past, her garden, her favorite books, but she hadn't shared the deeper truths. It wasn't just the move to this town. It was the way she had retreated into herself after her marriage ended, the way she had built walls around her heart so she wouldn't have to face the loneliness. She had told herself she was fine. She had told herself she was content. But in the quiet of their conversation, with the smell of tea and cake in the air, Margot felt exposed in a way she hadn't in years. "I suppose I was running away from something," she said slowly, her voice a little shaky. "I was tired of living in a place full of memories that no longer felt like mine. And I guess I thought moving here would help me start fresh." Alex looked at her with a depth that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in so long. There was no pity in his gaze, no judgment, just a quiet understanding that took her breath away. "You're not the only one who's run away from something," he said softly. "I think we all have our reasons for seeking something new." Margot blinked, the weight of his words settling in her chest. There was something in his voice, something unspoken, that made her heart beat faster. It was more than just shared experiences. It was the unspoken connection between them, the way they understood each other in a way that felt both foreign and incredibly familiar. Then, without thinking, she reached out, her hand brushing against his on the table. The contact was brief, but it sent a shiver through her. When she looked up, she saw that Alex was watching her, his expression soft and uncertain. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. The air between them had shifted, thick with unspoken feelings. Margot felt as though she were on the precipice of something beautiful and terrifying, and yet she couldn't bring herself to pull away. Alex's fingers brushed against hers once more, this time lingering. "I'm glad I came too, Margot." The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. In that quiet moment, Margot realized that their connection had deepened beyond friendship, far beyond what she had ever expected. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the warmth of possibility. The evening unfolded slowly, as if the world outside had softened, allowing Margot and Alex to exist in a bubble of shared silence and fragile understanding. The moment they had shared, the touch of his hand, lingered between them like an unspoken promise. After dinner, they moved to the couch, the gentle hum of the city outside the only sound breaking the quiet intimacy of the room. Margot watched Alex as he leaned back, a contented smile on his face. She could feel the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her chest. It was as if everything she had kept buried for so long, her loneliness, her hesitations, her desires, had come to the surface all at once. She glanced at him again, her heart skipping a beat. He was younger, of course. There was no denying it. His features were still sharp with the vitality of youth, and his life had just begun to bloom in ways hers no longer could. She had lived through decades, had built and rebuilt herself after loss, but there was something about him that made her feel alive again. Something about his quiet kindness, his openness, the way he saw her, that made her feel like a woman, not just someone's mother or someone's past. "You know, I keep thinking about the age difference between us," she said suddenly, her voice unsteady, as though speaking the words aloud would make them more real. Alex looked over at her, his gaze never faltering. "I don't see it." Her laugh was soft, a little unsure. "Of course you don't. But it's there, Alex. I've spent my life measuring time, keeping track of the years. It's hard not to see it when you're on this side of the equation." He was quiet for a long moment, and Margot could feel the weight of the silence between them. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, his dismissal, maybe, or some kind of awkward reassurance. What she didn't expect was the quiet strength in his next words. "I don't see time the way you do, Margot. I don't see your age. I see you, just you. The woman who's kind and intelligent and so full of life. The woman who's made me feel like I'm not the only one who's searching for something more." His words settled over her like a blanket, warming her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. There was something in the simplicity of his honesty that made her feel lighter. "I'm scared," she confessed. "Scared of what this means for both of us. Scared of what people will think. Scared of losing myself in something I don't fully understand." Alex moved closer, his presence comforting, steady. "You don't have to understand everything right now, Margot. You don't have to have it all figured out. All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel connected. And maybe that's all we need for now." She met his eyes, feeling the depth of his sincerity. There was no judgment in his gaze, no expectation. He wasn't asking her to be something she wasn't. He wasn't asking her to take a leap into the unknown. He was simply asking her to be present, to allow herself the space to experience what they had together. In that moment, Margot realized that love, real love, wasn't bound by time or societal expectations. It wasn't about measuring the years between them or worrying about what the world might think. Love was about connection, about the way two souls could find each other in the vastness of the world and say, "I see you." She felt a surge of clarity wash over her. The fears, the doubts, they were still there, but they no longer held power over her. In Alex's eyes, she saw not the years between them, but the space for something real, something that could grow into its own beautiful thing, without needing to fit into any mold. And for the first time in a long time, Margot felt at peace with the idea of embracing it, of embracing him. Margot sat by the window as the first light of dawn crept across the sky, painting the world in hues of soft pink and gold. The events of the previous evening felt like a dream, a beautiful, fragile dream that she hadn't dared to fully wake from. She glanced over at the empty space where Alex had been, the warmth of his presence still lingering in the air. He had left late last night, after hours of laughter, conversation, and quiet moments that spoke louder than words ever could. As she sat there, her thoughts drifted to all that had unfolded between them. The fear she had felt, the doubts she had carried, and the walls she had built around her heart. Each one had crumbled, piece by piece, until she was left with something that felt more real than anything she had experienced in years. Love wasn't supposed to be easy, she thought. It wasn't supposed to follow a set timeline or meet the expectations of others. And yet, here she was, at a point in her life where she least expected it, learning that love had no age limit, no expiration date. It had only the power to change, to evolve, to surprise. Margot had spent so many years alone, telling herself that she was content, that she didn't need anyone. But now she understood that love didn't just fill the spaces where loneliness once resided. It expanded them, made room for new possibilities, new growth. She thought of all the times she had allowed her fears to define her choices, of all the moments she had hidden from herself because of the way others might see her. But Alex, he had seen her, truly seen her, without the mask of age or time. He had embraced her for who she was, not for who society said she should be. And in doing so, he had freed her. The phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Alex. "Good morning, beautiful. I had a wonderful time last night. I can't wait to see you again." Her heart fluttered as she typed a reply, the words coming easily now. "I'm glad, Alex. I'm looking forward to seeing you too." As she set the phone down and turned her gaze back to the rising sun, Margot felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Love, she realized, was not bound by age. It wasn't measured in years or milestones. It was found in the quiet moments of connection, in the unexpected, and in the willingness to embrace what felt right, regardless of how it might look to the world. And in that moment, Margot knew, she was finally living the life she had always longed for. With Alex by her side, she no longer feared the unknown. She embraced it, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that the best was yet to come.